Hello.
Good morning. Thank you, Claire. You got in at 5 yesterday, and there you are, all set. I think it's the Bangalore air, and
Do you know what it is? It's the Bangalore people.
the people, of course, always. This is the 14th edition of the Bangalore Lit Fest, and I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of Shiny and Ravi and Krishnan, all the amazing people, and what an inspired setting. So technically we're all jailbirds today. It's a lovely feeling. I don't mind being in this jail.
I love it, and as someone who was a police officer for many years and who believes passionately in second chances and second lives, there's something really symbolic about being in a place like this which has been liberated.
How well put, but it can only happen in a city like Bengaluru, where people appreciate efforts of this kind, support efforts of this kind, as they have this very festival that we are at. To get to the book, just a small backgrounder, I read it, absorbed it, felt it, wept, cried, thought, which is what it's meant to do, all of that. And just before we started this session, we were talking and in the author's lounge, and Claire asked me, have you known grief? And my honest answer was, no, I have not. And that made me really think about how grief can be processed. No one is ever spared grief, which is what your book says. At different points in your life, you encounter it. What you do when you encounter grief, no one can tell you how to grieve, and there's no time limit for grief either. So I'd like to invite Claire to read a little from the book, so it will give all of you a flavor of the book and why she wrote it, because she has made her career as a best-selling crime writer, as we heard. So from crime to grief, there has to be a very strong motivational thrust for that.
There does, absolutely. And I wrote this book because my son died. My son died in 2006, so just coming up to 19 years ago. In fact, in 3 days' time, it will be exactly 19 years. And it still gets me sometimes. But if I read the introduction, I think it will give you a little bit of a flavor of why I wrote this book. I am in my late 40s. I have lost grandparents, friends, a father, a child. Grief has run through my life like thread through fabric. At times gossamer thin and barely there, other times weaving thick, clumsy darns across the ribs. In my grief, I am a mother, a child, a sister, a wife, a woman, a friend. I am also a writer. I have touched on grief in everything I've written because grief has touched every part of me. I write to make sense of the world and of my place in it, and I write to find people who feel the same way I do. I write in the hope that my words will resonate with others, that they will read a line over and over and say, this is how I feel.
Claire, do you see a cultural difference between the way we grieve in India, for example? You may not have direct experience of it, but you have traveled with the book across the world, and you know how people in your own country, how they address grief. Do you want to share a little of that, your observations about?
I do find it very interesting. I think there are generational differences in how we grieve. I think my generation grieve more openly than my parents, for example. What I saw actually that fascinated me was when my my publishers were selling this book to other countries. So what normally happens is I write a novel and my rights team go to lots of different countries and they sell the rights and it's published, and it's all very easy and exciting, and my novels are published in about 40 different languages. And so when I wrote this grief memoir, I Promise It Won't Always Hurt Like This, I sort of thought it would be the same process. And my rights team said, actually, we're finding it quite difficult to sell the book to certain countries, because some countries don't need a book on how to grieve. Some countries are very comfortable. And so, for example, Spain. Spain don't need a manual. Spain are very comfortable crying and grieving and talking about death. English people, very uncomfortable talking about death. Germans don't talk about death. And so all these cultural differences. My observation of India would be that actually grief is something you do quite well, that you are open with your sadness, that you honor the dead and celebrate their memory. Is that, you tell me, I'd love to know what you think.
There's a line in your book which you're talking about memory, and you called memories are like a beast. And we grieve differently in different states and across different caste barriers and across language barriers, across class barriers, but we grieve. Are we comfortable talking about grief? I think fair amount, yes. Also because in India there's the whole belief in the karmic cycle. So in that sense, it's not always a goodbye.
Yes, I think that's really key. I think actually that cultures that have a very strong faith are often much more comfortable talking about death and grief. But certainly for my culture, death is a really difficult subject. So I talk about death a lot. I'm really fun at parties. I think it's important, we tell small children in age-appropriate language where babies come from, but we don't tell them what happens when we die. And that's really odd to me. This is the cycle of life. It's going to happen to all of us. So I talk to my family about what I want to happen when I die. I make sure that, things are in order and that they know my wishes. And I think that one of the reasons why I wrote this book was to prompt more conversations about death and grief and what it means to us and how we can prepare, if we can prepare.
There's a big if there. It comes like a thread through your book, the if. And memory is again something that is a pattern that every chapter of yours sort of addresses in different ways. The book starts with on a very poignant note, and you're immediately drawn into your personal grief and why you wrote the book, because of the kind of messages that you were receiving, hundreds of them, the DMs that you were getting from across the world, of people who had not processed their own grief and were looking to you for answers. So was that your main motivation to switch from crime to grief?
It was, yes, it was. And I mean, gosh, I don't have the answers. What I have is lived experience, that combination, I suppose, of having been through something myself and also being a writer who knows how to use words to make people feel heard and seen. So the story that you're referring to at the start of the book was something that happened maybe 4 or 5 weeks after my son had died. He was a baby. He contracted meningitis when he was 3 weeks old, and he died when he was 5 weeks old. And he had a twin, and so and that twin is now 19 years old. And I was in a state of acute grief and still sort of reeling from the shock of what had happened, having to keep going for my surviving baby. And a woman came to my door, a stranger, with a bunch of daffodils. And you'll see that there are daffodils on the cover. Do you have daffodils in India? Do they grow
in
here?
some states?
In some states. And this woman brought me these daffodils, and she said that she had lost a child many years before, and she had come to my door to tell me that it wouldn't always hurt the way it was hurting then. And this is a really shameful thing for me to admit, but I was really angry with her. She'd done this lovely thing. It was a very kind, very generous gesture, and I hated it. And I thought privately, you're wrong. It will always hurt like this. In fact, it's going to kill me. I genuinely thought this grief that I felt was going to kill me because it was a physical sensation. I don't know how many of you have known grief, but I had not been prepared for the physicality of it. I knew I would be sad. I knew I would cry. But I felt like I felt 20 years older. My legs were heavy. My chest, I couldn't breathe properly because my chest was so tight and my hair was falling out. It was so horrendous, and I thought, I'm dying of this. And I looked at this woman and I thought, and this is the shameful bit, I thought, you can't have loved your child the way I love mine, because if you really had loved your child, you wouldn't be standing here, you wouldn't have survived, you wouldn't have your hair brushed and your makeup on and be able to come and comfort a stranger. You cannot have loved your child, which is an awful, awful thing to have thought. But one of the things I learned about grief is that grief is not always kind or pretty, or, I think I'd imagined grief would be a slightly romantic, sitting, sobbing gently with my handkerchief, being very quiet and feminine, and actually grief is ugly and angry and mean, and that's kind of okay. So this woman came to my door, I didn't believe her, and then about 14 years later, I forgot the anniversary of my son's death. So it's December 10th. It's always been December 10th, obviously. And every year it's been pretty horrific. And then at some point, I don't know when, it just changed. And on this particular year, I woke up and I carried on doing my thing. And then I got halfway through the day and I looked at the date, and there was that little kind of nagging sensation that I had to do something. And then I thought, this is when Alex died. And I felt overwhelmingly guilty, obviously. And then I felt quite proud because I was still here. And I wasn't only surviving, I was thriving. And I remembered that woman, and I apologized in my head to her because she was right. And so I tweeted about this experience, and what I wanted to do was to pay it forward. I wanted to promise what she'd promised, that it wouldn't always hurt like this. And those tweets went viral. 18 million people saw them, read them, and all these messages came in. And that's when I thought, I need to write about this.
And the structure of the book, because each chapter is like a promise. And we were talking earlier, and you very clearly remembered that, like you said, that on the 10th of December, you said Alex would have been 19. And in between was a phase where you kind of had dealt with it a little better, come out of it. The heaviness in your chest had lessened. You were able to cope with daily life. But when people come to you and you can see that they are grieving the way you were grieving, is there, like you said with that lady, there was a judgmental attitude that you had because actually you were so angry yourself and you hadn't come to terms with any of it. Do you find that happening now? Do you get kind of impatient with people who expect you to be the expert on grief and to provide instant answers? Well, if this has happened to you, then this is what you should do. Like, it's a manual that's going to tell you step 1, step 2, step 3. Does that happen?
No, I think it's the opposite. I think what I've learned is there is no way to solve grief. There are no steps. There's no journey that we're all going to go on in the same way. Grief is entirely personal, and it's personal to a point that if you lose two people close to you, you will not grieve them the same way, because your grief it's a mirror of the love that you had for that person, and so it's always going to be different. And equally, you're not going to grieve someone in the same way that someone else will. So two siblings who lose a mother are going to experience that grief in different ways because their relationship was different, and that is okay. I noticed so my husband and I obviously were grieving our son, and a very wise nurse told me very early on in our grieving journey that trying to look after each other through this grief is like asking two people with the flu to nurse each other. They can't, they're too sick. They have to get help from the outside. And so I'm actually very careful in offering advice now to grieving people. But when I do, that's the thing that I try and encourage them to do, because I think there is a temptation to feel like you have to handle this on your own, or just lean on your inner circle. And actually, if that inner circle is all struggling, you need to look further. So in writing this book, what I wanted to do was not give. It's not a how-to book. This is not how to grieve. What it is a book of hope. It's a book that firstly shows you that there is something. There are blue skies ahead when it feels like you're in the middle of a storm. But it's also a book that is brutally honest about those really ugly sides of grief. Because when I read books, when I was right in the trenches of grief, I didn't see myself. I didn't see that, horrible person who lost her temper all the time. And so that is what I wanted to write in here. And each chapter is a different promise, a different, it examines what I think of as the symptoms of grief. Because I think grief is a bit like a chronic illness that, you have good days and bad days. And often if you live with a chronic illness, other people don't see it, but you feel it all the time. And so these promises deal with these different symptoms. So perhaps before we have questions, I'll just read those promises. So each of these promises is a chapter. I promise it won't always hurt like this, that you won't always lie awake at night, sobbing until you cannot breathe. I promise the waves of grief that knock you off your feet won't drown you. I promise you will find a way to say goodbye and a reason to keep going. I promise this won't always be your first thought in the morning, that you won't always fear the worst. I promise you won't always feel so angry, so guilty, so tired. I promise you'll find someone who understands. I promise you won't always be winded by someone else's happiness, broken by anniversaries or shaken by questions you can't answer. I promise you will be happy again, that one day you'll be able to pay it forward. I promise you won't forget. I promise it won't always hurt like this.
One question from me, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Do you think men and women grieve differently in your experience? Did your husband and you, with your expression of that grief?
So differently. Firstly, because grief is so personal, and sometimes he was feeling up and I was feeling down, and sometimes it's the other way, and so you can be out of sync. But also because there is a huge expectation on men to be strong. And I would notice when people would come to our house to offer support, to bring food, and as they left, they would say to him, "Look after her," or "How's she doing?" Really. Nobody ever asked me how my husband was doing. No one ever told me to look after him. And I think that actually this is indicative of men's mental health in general, that we need to look at our guys and say, are you okay? And men, you need to talk more Just saying.
Absolutely, and a big hurrah for that. We will be taking questions. We have about 8 minutes for questions. So there are traveling mics.
You spoke about the woman who was a stranger to you and how you were angry with her, you were judgmental of her. Say you had a friend who did not know how to help you out in that moment of grief. What would have been the best way for her to help you out?
That's such a great question, because we will all be supporters in someone else's grief. So there are two things, thank you, there are two things that I think are really helpful for us to do as supporters. The first one is in the question that we ask. The automatic question to ask is, how are you feeling? And that is such a hard question to answer because it's a big, big question. And I find it really helpful to ask, how are you feeling today? That's it. How are you feeling right now? Because sometimes it's okay to be feeling good today. And it's hard to say that without, sort of not acknowledging the enormity of the sadness that you're feeling. So just how are you feeling today is my top tip. And the other one is about help. And we have a tendency, again, to say, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know. And I don't ask that anymore, because I don't say that. Because that puts the responsibility on that grieving person. That means that the grieving person has to think, well, what do I need? And I have to reach out. And I'm not going to reach out because that's really hard. So now what I do instead is I say things like, I'm bringing food to you on Wednesday evening. Is there anything you can't eat? Or have you got room in your freezer? Or I say, I can walk your dog for you 3 times next week. Which days are best? Or let me have the kids after school. When do you want me to do it? So be really specific in the help that you offer. And I think those two things are useful.
That's just so brilliant, so practical, and it really puts a completely different spin, because most of us, out of a sense of inadequacy, would do exactly what you said. We'd say, can I help in some way? And mean it. But the onus then becomes on the person who's grieving.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one other point on that sometimes people don't know what to say, and they don't say anything, and it's awful for us on the grieving side, because it feels like you are ignoring our grief, that you're frightened of it, that it feels contagious. And so even if all you can say is, I don't know what to say, I'm so sorry, that's enough, but say something.
There are many hands going up.
You said that you forgot your son's death anniversary on a particular year, and that led me to sort of think, was there a guilt that was associated with overcoming the grief? Although, as though saying that you must grieve more, and that why have I stopped grieving? Do I really deserve to do that?
Oh, you are so young to be so profound and self-aware. Your mother must be so proud. Yes, I think guilt and grief are twins. We feel guilty that we didn't say the things we wanted to say. We feel guilty that we said the things we didn't want to say. We feel guilty that we're not moving forward with our life, and then we feel guilty that we are. It takes a long time to reconcile that. Now I don't feel guilty for being happy now. I know that is a positive thing, but I think it is a natural part of the grieving process that we also have to handle the guilt that goes along with it. Thank you.
Claire, our hearts break for you. I wanted to know, how you coped with the child who survived, and what was his experience of your grief.
Thank you.
Because this is, I don't know, I don't have the words, but our hearts break for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Dhanyavadya. My surviving son's grief story is his own, and he was a baby. He has what I think of as a cellular memory of his son. When they were babies and they were in the same cot, I would put them apart and they would shuffle towards each other and become what I always thought of as speech marks together, and now suddenly I just had a single speech mark. And he did struggle. It became even more complex because a year later I gave birth to another set of twins, which was not in my plan, and forced me to confront what I'd lost, because I saw those twins grow up and I saw my lone twin grow up without his shadow. But we talk a lot as a family, and Alex is always very present in our lives. He will always be my firstborn son. I will always have had 4 children. It's a difficult question to answer when you've lost someone, when you've lost a child, and people ask, how many children do you have? Because you never quite know what to say. But in my heart, I have 4 children, even if I only have 3 in my house.
Claire, was this the book you wished you could read when you were going through your incredible loss? So was this the book you wished you had at the time?
Thank you. It is exactly the book I wished I could read, because the books that I did read, and I read a lot, were written by experts. They were written by psychotherapists and grief counselors and people who analysed grief and told me that these were the steps I would walk through, and that's not what was happening to me. And I wanted to hear from someone who had been through it, who could be absolutely brutally honest about what it was like and what might help, but also what might not, but acknowledge the fact that it was very personal. And I wrote this from the heart. It is a conversation between me and another grieving person, whether that person has lost a child, a mother, a friend, a beloved pet. Grief is grief, and that honesty was important. So yes, it is the book that I needed back then.
We have time for just one more question.
Hi Claire, that was very nice. I have a friend I had a friend who passed away little more than a year back, and his son is still in touch with me. The other day he asked me, I'm not able to get over it, and I said I had a similar problem. I lost my dad in my 20s. So he goes, there are 7 stages of grief or 5 stages of grief, and I'm like, you grieve you. I don't know, is it important to be academic in that sense?
That's a good question, and I'm so sorry for your loss and for his. I'm sure that for some people, those academic stages of grief, I'm sure they're super helpful. And if they are, that's great. I don't want to stop anyone going anywhere for advice. But this is the thing, isn't it? Is you have to find what works for you. And I always say so quite often people message and say, should I buy this one for a friend? Will it help me? And I always say, borrow it from a library or buy it or whatever. And if it doesn't help you, throw it away. You put it down. That's the brilliant thing about books, is we can pick them up and put them down. We can dip in and dip out. We don't get over grief. Your friend is not going to get over it. We get through it. It is a journey. And what I've discovered is it's like taking a really long journey on a train and being immersed in that journey. And when you get on the train, you're really aware of what's around you. And then you read your book or you have a conversation. And when you look up, you look out of the window and the landscape has changed. The city has gone and outside is fields and trees. And you don't know at what point it changed, but it definitely changed, and that is what will happen on your grief journey.
Thank you so very much. It's great. The people of Bangalore, on a Sunday morning, we have a full house and a very, very powerful book written by an amazing lady. Thank you for your time, Claire.
It was
Thank
wonderful.
you all for being here.
Daniel
Thank you so
Vadia,
much.
and if you want to speak to me, I'm going to be signing books at the bookshop, so come and talk.